it's me, I'm Deep in the Read, and today I have with me in the studio a comically large pile of books, because I'm a booktuber, and what else are we for if not to show large quantities of books at a camera sometimes? So that's what I'm doing today. Although this is not a book haul, actually this year I'm planning on not buying any books at all. I bought a single book and I'm going to try to keep it to the single book that I bought. We'll get to the book that I bought. But the point is, this year I'm going to read all the books, or a bunch of the books that I own but haven't gotten around to yet. You read books so that you can impress on all the people around you that you're really, really smart. But right now I'm kind of in pseudo-intellectual status mode because people come into my apartment, they see my many books on the shelf, and they say, "Gee Willikers, you seem like a really well-read person. You must be so big-brained." And I have to, like, pretend that I've read every book on my shelf when in fact I've read less than half of them. So we're going to fix that this year and not buy any books and just focus on what we already own. So I'm going to talk about the books that I want to read this year and give you an idea of where I'm at and what my interests are in terms of what I want to do. Anyway, starting off, I'm going to go over the categories of the books that I want to read this year and then just kind of fly through this stack. And this stack doesn't comprise every book I want to read this year. I'm sure a lot of miscellaneous books will pop in, and some of the books that I mention in this I won't end up reading. I'm trying to keep it fairly loose. But anyway, talking about the goal. So in addition to sticking to books that I own but haven't read yet, I'm going to basically stay away from buying any books. So if there's a book I want to read that I don't own, I'm going to rely on either borrowing it from friends or the library, or from accessing it for free via the internet. So my categories this year are like, I tend to strike a balance between fiction and non-fiction without even trying, so that's going to be the case this year as well. The categories are going to be, for non-fiction, I'm of course going to stick to history because that's my bread and butter, but the history I'm going to read is going to be books on ancient Rome and by ancient writers, books on dictatorships and tyranny, miscellaneous history books that I've been wanting to get to for a while, and then for fiction, I've got general literary fiction, which tends to be my favorite sort of thing to read, and I've got fantasy fiction, which I want to try and get more into, and then there's sort of miscellaneous fiction, and I'm leaving it very wide open with a lot of the fiction. With that said, I think we can jump right into the first category, which is ancient Rome. I've been into ancient Rome for a while, but it's really clicked for me, like in the last year or two, where I've been chomping at the bit to get into it, and I've read one book so far. That was Tom Holland's Rubicon. That was an excellent history book. And I've read two ancient texts. I've read Virgil's Aeneid, and I've read Ovid's Metamorphoses. I just finished Metamorphoses, and I actually didn't like it. So we're not off to a good start. I found it very difficult for someone who's new. Maybe it was the translation. This is a prose translation as opposed to a verse translation. But the stories were bouncing all over the place in a way that was very hard to keep track of. It was very schizophrenic reading, especially for someone who's only slightly familiar. But the other two books that I haven't gotten around to yet, that are by ancient Roman writers, are The Early History of Rome by Livy, and Suetonius's account of the first 12 Caesars of Rome. These are both ancient historians, so they were both living in the sort of early imperial period. Livy was a very prominent author in his own day. People would come to Rome to try and meet him, to buy his books. He was writing the entire history of Rome, and it took him 145 books to do it, and only 35 of his books survive until our own time. This book here contains the first 5 of Livy's works, and I've heard that this, as well as his account of the war with Hannibal, are the two really good entry points for reading Livy. Suetonius is a little bit more, I get the impression that he's a little bit more easy or accessible to read for somebody who's kind of fresh to it, because Suetonius basically goes through the lives of the first 12 Caesars, but he's very gossipy, so he goes for the juicy personal stuff, so sort of like a yellow journalist. He's talking about the sexual proclivities of some of these emperors, things like that, so that should be interesting to read, and it'll also serve as a good introduction to the figure in my next book on Rome, which is this biography on the first emperor of Rome, Augustus. And I really want to get more into this character or learn more about him because he basically, I think he ruled Rome for like 50 years, so the longest reigning emperor ever in the history of Rome. And apparently he's also the best one. Like, I hear all these like Roman history snobs saying, oh my god, this guy was like the genius politician. So I'm curious to read that. And speaking of empire, speaking of emperors and pure power and authoritarianism, the next topic that I'm interested in reading about this year is dictatorships and fascism and tyranny of all shades and stripes. I wonder why that would be relevant, but it's always relevant, so I'm going to like do a deep dive into these dark, depressing history books that I have here. First off, I'm going to start with Alan Castle's book on fascism. This is apparently something that used to be assigned to people who were taking political theory classes in university. I found this on the side of the road with a bunch of like political philosophy books just in a box getting thrown away. This was published in 1975 and it kind of runs over various fascist dictatorships. Basically it's Italy and Germany. That's most of the book from what I gather. But it also sort of talks about fascism beyond that. It talks about the fascism in Spain and things like that, and just kind of the very different shades of it and what counts as fascism and what doesn't. And with everyone always calling each other a fascist, I would like to be able to accurately call people fascists. I don't know, I think that would be a cool thing to learn how to do, to, bring some balance to political discourse. Just jump into any discussion I want and be like, you're a fascist, and then I'll be right because I've read this book. Aside from that, I've also got this book on the Gulag system in the Soviet Union, and I've got a book on the Great Famine in China after Mao came to power. It's kind of contentious and controversial as to whether Mao was the sole reason that the famine happened at all. There's sort of communist apologists who say it wasn't all his fault, but obviously this book believes that it was Mao's fault, or at least the fault of his party, that made the famine as bad as it was. So I'm very interested in reading about that. And then the biggie, of course, this is Lenny Yahil's massive book, award-winning book on the Holocaust, which came out in the late 80s. I would like to really do a deep dive. I mean, this is a big, thick book, and apparently it's really good at not only giving you the broad picture and also the diving into the personal things that were going on, but it also dispels a lot of rumors, or so I'm told. It talks about how the Jewish population didn't willingly go to their deaths like everybody kind of mythologizes. It wasn't like, oh, let's go, I'll go on the train, we don't know where we're going. There was a lot of resistance, there was a lot of rebellion, there was a lot of partisan action, and apparently this book gets into that. Of course, though, with the title being The Fate of European Jewry, it of course focuses on the Jewish perspective. There's a few other books I also want to read on dictatorships that I don't own. For example, there's a book on North Korea called The Cleanest Race, another book on North Korea called Under the Loving Care of the Fatherly Leader, or something like that, and The Party, which is a book on the Chinese political party from their whole history. And then I also have a few books that are historical fiction. This one is Europe Central. This is basically like a fictionalized account where it kind of runs over the history of the Soviet Union versus the Nazi Germany, and kind of their ideology, their culture, and it kind of goes into a lot of things that are true, but it also interweaves them with things that are like characters in the book. And I think it's just kind of like a mishmash of memoir and history and things like that. It's apparently fairly experimental. And then the other historical fiction book that I want to read is called The Feast of the Goat by the Peruvian author Mario Vargas Llosa. That one is about a woman living in the Dominican Republic while there was, I think, a dictatorship going on there. And then the last book, which I guess arguably could be about authoritarianism in a way, I guess, is Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. It's basically about how news acts as a propaganda arm for the government through being funded by government parties or political parties, basically regurgitating things that people want to hear, or regurgitating certain aspects of a news story to manipulate people into going along with a policy. For example, after 9/11 happened, just whip up the national fervor as much as you possibly can, and then tell people, oh yeah, by the way, we're going after Saddam Hussein because he's got weapons of mass destruction, and just don't really focus on the fact that that doesn't really have anything to do with 9/11. Just kind of equivocate them and use the media to sort of help that along. And I feel like a book that analyzes media is really relevant. I mean, it's always relevant, but it seems to be particularly relevant now. Maybe that's just the bias of the fact that I'm living through this time, but anyway, Noam Chomsky is a really prominent political theorist and linguist, so I think it's high time that I get into some of his writing. And then there's miscellaneous history that I want to read. A couple of extra books, like I've had this book, Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, for a long, long time. Barbara Tuchman is mostly known for writing The Guns of August, which also won a Pulitzer Prize. But this book, yeah, like I said, I found it for like 20 cents or something. It's like this big book, and I found it dirt cheap, so I was like, oh, I know Barbara Tuchman, and so this must be at least decent. It covers like the Black Plague, it covers the rebellions and attempted revolutions by the peasants that followed, it covers like little wars that were happening, and I do want to get more into the Middle Ages at some point, so I feel like this is a good sort of entry point for that. I've been reading a 3-volume work on Martin Luther King. It's by Taylor Branch. It's called America During the King Years. And I read the first volume last year, and it was a frickin' masterpiece. Easily one of the best books I read that year, like in the top 2. And then I read the second one, and it was I found it very scatterbrained and not structured very well. And then volume 3 deals with the last 3 years of Martin Luther King's life, including the Selma protests, including his pushback against the Vietnam War, being alienated by political allies, and making enemies between himself and Lyndon B. Johnson. And Taylor Branch is an excellent historian. He's won a Pulitzer Prize, so I'm very keen on finishing off this series. Like, it's huge. This is the 3rd volume, and altogether it's like 2,800 pages, so finishing it will be quite the accomplishment on my part. I've got this book about my home province of Nova Scotia, Canada. It's about an incest cult. This is a true story about, so this abused little girl comes into school, and she starts talking about how, oh, my parents do this, that, and the other thing to me, and then the teachers were like, you don't say, and then the whole book is kind of like a court thing, recounting, discovering that there's like this big incest cult operating in this small community in Nova Scotia. So yeah, always a happy tale when it comes to my province. But yeah, that's basically it for history. There are a few other ancient writing books that I want to read. So we're getting into fiction now, but to complement the Distant Mirror book on the Middle Ages, I have Canterbury Tales. And this is the one book that I bought this year. I got it for like $1.50, and this is a translation from the Middle English. And I know that I said in my Worm Ouroboros review that I wanted to get into like older English writing. I'm gonna have to wait, I guess, because this is a little bit modernized, but I do plan on reading Shakespeare this year, so I'll still get a little bit of taste for that old English stuff that I'm wanting to get more used to reading. In terms of other ancient tales that I would like to read, I would like to read the Oresteia by I don't know how to pronounce his name, a Greek poet, a Greek playwright, and then I also want to read Beowulf. I want to read the Eddas. I know I've got more written here. I want to read the Iliad for sure, and Oh, I also have a friend, a Hindu friend, who said that she would be up to lending me the Bhagavad Gita, so I would be up for that as well. So that brings us to fantasy. And I'm not really that big into fantasy. I have a complicated history with it. I don't really like Lord of the Rings. I don't really like Game of Thrones. I don't really like Dune, and you get it. So a lot of people that I talk to, when they learn this about me, they're just like, you should stop reading fantasy. Clearly you're not into it. And I disagree. I think it's just a matter of finding what's right for you, and sometimes you have to go off the beaten path for that. Like I read The Broken Sword by Powell Anderson, and that's where I was like, oh my god, I finally found a foothold in this genre. So I realized I have to go kind of off the beaten path. And so I've got sort of a list of like fantasy novels that I want to read this year that are kind of not spoken about that much. I want to read Gloriana by Michael Moorcock, which is like apparently a very like racy, risque kind of soft fantasy book where there's not really any magic elements. It's basically like a pretend kingdom in a pretend Middle Ages about like this princess trying to discover herself through sexuality. And then there's, I want to read some Lord Dunsany stuff, like The King of Elfland's Daughter, for example. And then there's this, which I realize is a popular book. This is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. And like I said, I'm not really into popular fantasy, so I realize I'm taking a bit of a risk with this one. But I'm going to be reading it next month with a friend, and hopefully I can make it through this giant brick without thinking it's like Lord of the Rings and throwing it across the room in frustration. I also want to include sort of palate cleanser fantasy, like fantasy that's more digestible, which means if I'm reading fantasy and I get sick of it, I will dive into manga or graphic novels that are fantasy, like Neon Genesis Evangelion, or Berserk, or Full Metal Alchemist, or I don't know, something like Hellboy. Like, just something that's kind of got that magic fantasy element stuff in it, so that would kind of be a way to, like, balance out the big, thick, heavy world building of fantasy novels. So, moving away from fantasy for a sec, going into general fiction, just sort of miscellaneous fiction books that I've been meaning to read for a long time, but haven't gotten around to yet. So, for one thing, I would really like to finally read Stone Butch Blues, by Leslie Feynman, I think is the author's name. They are a genderqueer author. They were writing sort of a memoir in the 70s, so it's very, very much ahead of its time. I hear it's excellent. I would like to read some Spanish writers, so I've already mentioned Mario Vargas Llosa for The Feast of the Goat earlier on, but I also finally want to read Don Quixote. I've got blah 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 blah. My library has the Edith Grossman translation, which I'm told is the best translation that's been done of it. I don't know, but that's what I hear, so that's the one I'm going to read. Then I'm going to also read some African fiction. There's a Kenyan author by the name of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I think that's how you pronounce his name, and I hear that he's an excellent writer who's like criminally underrated, so I want to try at least one of his books this year. I hear Petals of Blood is really good, so that's the book I'm going to try by him. I know nothing about it. I'm just going to go in blind, just knowing that he's very highly esteemed. And then there's a few other classics that I would like to read, in addition to Don Quixote, but these are much more, I guess, normie to read, if that makes sense. So, I've been sort of a fan of Charles Dickens for a few years now. I've read like one of his books a year for the past 3 years. Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, Great Expectations. I liked all of them. The only book of his that I own that I haven't read yet is David Copperfield. It's also the biggest book I own of his, and it's like 1,000 pages. So I'm a little bit intimidated, but you know, I wanna finish this book. I've got like a set of books that have this style, all from my grandfather, so it would be nice to say that I've read them all. Then I've got this E.M. Forster book. I don't know where it came from. I don't know where I found it. I just happened to be going through my old books at my parents' house, and I was like, when did I get a book by E.M. Forster? So it's Howard's End, which is apparently a classic. I'm going to read it. see what happens. I'm also really curious to read his book Maurice. E.M. Forster was a closeted gay man for his whole life, and the only reason we know that is because he had a book that he was sitting on that only released after his death, which is explicitly about a gay relationship. It's called Maurice. I've heard people pronounce it Morris. Like, if I enjoy Howard's End, I'm probably gonna look up Maurice and read that as well. Then another author who writes bricks is James Michener. He wrote historical fiction. All his books were titled after places, or a lot of his books were. He's got books called like Texas and Mexico and Alaska, which is this one. And again, these were from my grandfather after he passed away. A lot of his books got left to me, and James Michener was apparently a pretty big name in the 80s, so I'm curious to see how he writes like novels in which a place is the main character. I will find out for sure when I read this. And yeah, what else do we have here? Oh yeah, I want to read Anna Karenina. I want to read some Russian literature. I own a copy of it, but it's at my parents' place. I tried Dr. Zhivago earlier this year, and it was fucking awful. I gave it a 1 star, and I was so shocked because A, I'm into classics, B, I like foreign and translated works, and C, it dealt with history that I'm really interested in, you know, the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. But Dr. Zhivago was boring as fuck, so hopefully Anna Karenina is a little bit easier to read despite its length. And if not, I have a Dostoevsky book. I think I have The Idiot, so I'll read one of those too. We'll see. But for now, the only book that I bought this year is The Canterbury Tales, and I'm going to try to keep it that way. Again, the goal this year for my reading is to only read books that I either already own and haven't gotten to yet, or something that I can access for free, whether it be by borrowing, by getting an online copy that's free. I plan on utilizing Project Gutenberg for some of the books that I mentioned. Project Gutenberg is like an online archive of all these really historical texts, like everything from like Dickens all the way back to like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Like, so basically the entire history of humanity in a literary sense is available for free on Project Gutenberg, so I'm going to be utilizing them. So yeah, that's my goal for this year. Anyway, if you see any books in this video that you want me to review or that you're curious about, or books that you've read and you want to tell me about, let me know in the comments. I would love to know what books you guys are interested in, what books you'd be interested in seeing me review, things like that. And the final thing is, with all these books that I have to read and the fact that most of them are like really, really thick, I have to say that my video output is going to slow down dramatically. The next book that I plan on reading is this one. This is 1,000 pages, and I realize that most booktubers tend to read so quickly that they have to fireproof their books in order to prevent them from catching on fire from the sheer friction of the page turning. Not so with me. I'm a really, really slow reader. This book may take me 2 months. So I can't, like, if I want to keep up with my reading this year, I'm gonna have to hold off on the videos a little bit, wait until I've at least finished this until I get a new review out. So yeah, expect to slow down with my video output, but I will be reading vociferously while I'm gone. And yeah, hopefully this was entertaining and not just a big fucking mess that I vomited all over YouTube. I know I tend to do that a lot. I tend to go on and on. But anyway, happy reading. Happy 2022. Have a good reading year. Here's a book. Go read it.